Good evening. So tonight we have, well, some could see it as an ordeal, some could see it as a pleasant experience. We'll see what happens. But there's a lot, and there's so much more, as always in history, but also there's a lot of initials and same first names and third husbands and 18th wives and things of that nature, and an astonishing court trial. So let's play along and see just exactly how it works. And I'll give a somewhat dry introduction, and then we'll get into what could be more entertaining, I hope. Since the mid-17th century, when the first Europeans arrived at the South Fork, they followed the trails of our ancient native population, and they saw both beauty and bounty. To those early European colonists, their distance from the motherland was heartening, but the lands that stretched out before them with their grassy plains, powerful winds, and highway of water offered them their future prosperity. These Puritan colonists were only the start of many waves of immigrants and visitors who have come to East Hampton, some to settle for generations, others to spend the high season. Each movement has brought both accomplishments and missteps. Our land was considered a tool to be used as long as it lasted. As the centuries moved onward, each decade has revealed how our environment, both man-made and natural, has been altered. People have spent their summer months in East Hampton since well before the Civil War. We have records surviving that clearly show renters on Main Street as early as the 1820s. We have letters from tourists talking about the glory of our beaches and the dusty wagon trips to Montauk Light, and those go back to the late 1700s. We were discovered many times, every other year by the New York Times. But what 21st century visitors see when they walk down East Hampton Village's Main Street is an achievement that owes much to many individuals, village government, and several institutions. Now, I'm going to focus on one family of summer colonists that has left its mark on East Hampton Village in many remarkable projects that preserve the past, beautify the present, and continue to enhance the cultural and aesthetic climate for the future. So we're going to talk about the Woodhouse family. And to get into the Woodhouse family is interesting only because there are a number of names that are somewhat similar. Some of them, there's a lot of information about. Others were making their money in very small communities with weekly newspapers or not even newspapers, so it's a little hard to get information. But our delving into the Woodhouse family has revealed one thing to us that's really pretty extraordinary and has nothing to do with the summer colony. When we were working with the Woodhouse family as an ancient name in England, we found that recent genealogists in England think that they have found Lion Gardner's mother. She married a Lionel Gardner and produced a young man by the name of Lion Gardner, exactly the same date as the birth of our Lion Gardner. And in these new English genealogies, it says that he in fact came to Boston, and then Saybrook, and then came to East Hampton, where he died, and then talks about marrying. So we're in the process of trying to do a little more research on that, but that is sort of fascinating, I think. So that's something to look forward to. It's either right or wrong. You can never tell. Now, one important thing with people who have lots of money is certainly to find out where the money comes from. And that proves to be one of the harder features of the Woodhouse family. So what I'm going to do is give you tiny biographies of the major males in the family, and that's just because we have more information on them, and they also tended to be the ones who either made the money or were smart to marry women whose fathers had made a lot of money. So, you know, there's many ways of making money. So I think it's interesting to look at the father of Lorenzo G. and Charles, the two brothers, because it's a little interesting to know, you know, what kind of father they had, what kind of life were they involved in. And we found the father quite interesting. Charles Woodhouse was born in Wethersfield, Connecticut in 1812. He became a Universalist minister in Albany, New York, and went on to preach at the Brick Church in Brattleboro, Vermont. After moving to many small communities in Iowa and Illinois, he decided to become a doctor of homeopathic arts at the age of 53. He taught at the college in Chicago, and then moved to Rutland, Vermont, and that's where he died as a doctor. And he had two children. Well, the two we're going to talk about, there are really three: Charles Williamson Woodhouse and his younger brother Lorenzo Guernsey Woodhouse. Now, Charles Williamson Woodhouse is one that we don't know as well as his younger brother. He was born in 1835. He was the president of the Merchants National Bank of Burlington, Vermont, which was founded in 1849. And by 1876, its capital was $700,000, which was astonishing, I understand, for a small Vermont city. Charles's brother, Lorenzo Woodhouse, was one of the directors of the bank, even though he certainly wasn't around very often. And Charles's son, Lorenzo Easton Woodhouse, or Lorenzo E. Woodhouse, as we usually call him out here, was a cashier. Charles was also the treasurer of the Farmers and Mechanics Savings Bank of Vermont. And it was interesting to see Vermont, at the time of these two banks, there were two other banks in Brattleboro. So there were a lot of banks around, sort of like the bank crush we had about 40 years ago. And trust company. He was also treasurer of the city of Burlington, and he was a state senator from 1880 to 1881. And if you'll show, that's a picture of him, sorry. And then this is his house on Willard Street in Burlington. And it was built in 1883. And he had several lots, and contiguous with this house, he built one for his son, Edward E. Woodhouse. And all of the houses, there's a couple other buildings, a magnificent carriage house. Another slide will show you. All of these houses are now part of the Champlain College campus. So they've all been preserved. And this one, in fact, supposedly has a wonderful restaurant, and this is the inn for parents to stay who are visiting their children. Now, Lorenzo Guernsey Woodhouse, we have a very interesting photograph next that shows Mr. Woodhouse in Company 7, the New York Infantry Company during the Civil War, which was a silk stocking infantry. It spent most of its time in Washington, D.C. But this is a recent discovery, this photograph. And he was Charles's younger brother. He married Emma D. Arrowsmith, the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Edgar and Maria Arrowsmith of New York City. He and his family, which was only daughter Emma, moved to Chicago, and he started work at J.B. Cooley and Company, maker of harnesses and other bridles out of both celluloid and rubber. He later on joined a firm and became a partner with the department store King Marshall Field. In 1885, he moved to New York City and became the resident buyer at Marshall Field's department store. And it was interesting to find out when we tried to trace his townhouse in New York, it's now the site of the Museum of Modern Art. And that was a very ritzy neighborhood back when he would have been there in the 1880s and so. And then we have Lorenzo E. Woodward and Easton, and this is what he looked like when he was 13 years old. And he was born in Burlington, Vermont. And he worked at his father, Charles's, he worked at his father's bank. He married Mary Leland Kennedy in 1896. Her father started as a teacher and then turned to bookkeeping, and then later partnered with his brother in a large produce company. He then went on to play a major role in the founding of the Burlington Woolen Company, which was one of the big firms, and we even know the name still today, although it's not anywhere near Vermont. He also found time to be a Vermont state senator. When Lorenzo's father died, he inherited the presidency of the Merchants Bank of Burlington. So he went up from cashier relatively quickly to being the president of the bank. So you will have the next picture is a pretty amazing one that shows Lorenzo. He's on the far left as a cashier about 1896 at the bank in Burlington. And he was president of the bank from between 1914 and 1929. So now we're going to talk about Lorenzo Guernsey Woodhouse, because he's the one that really sort of gets the family to where we know. So why don't we go to the next slide, since this isn't very interesting. There. The Woodhouse family arrived on the East End when the recently retired Lorenzo G. Woodhouse built a cottage, Locust Grove, on one of 3 contiguous lots he owned on Shelter Island. The large cottage, this is not his cottage, but he plays a role in this. If this is a cottage, I mean, I don't know, it looks rather like Coney Island to me. But the large cottage was a wedding present for their only child, Grace, who had married Robert Roosevelt Jr. in 1890. Now, you know, how did the Woodhouses and the Roosevelts get together? It's called the Union Club in New York. That's what Mr. Woodhouse was a very important member of that, and one of the things he was most loved at the Union Club for was making arrangements to bring Mark Twain down from Connecticut to give a lecture. And he had the pleasure of introducing him, right. The groom, they were married in 1890, and the groom was Theodore Roosevelt's first cousin. The wedding was on April 7th, Easter Monday, and held at New York City's All Souls Church. The guest list, which was very lengthy and typical of the Brooklyn Eagle, completely listed. I'll just give you a few to give you an idea that we've got Grover Cleveland and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall Field. That's pretty logical. That's where his dad worked. Theodore Roosevelt and his wife. And I thought very interesting to see Austin Corbin of the Long Island Railway was, one of the people at the event. Lorenzo was a financial backer for the building of the Manhasset House as part of the Shelter Island Improvement Association. And he very quickly, he quickly got involved in the Osborne Bank here, and he was very quick to sit on boards and things of that nature. The next slide shows you this charming little church that did for a while belong to the Historical Society. And I just go to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, June 7th, 1890. And it says, Mr. Henry Norris and Henry Whitney of Brooklyn, Thomas Hogan, Frank Robertson, Henry Anthony, Henry Motley, and Lorenzo G. Woodhouse of New York City have associated themselves under the corporate title of the Manhasset Chapel to build a free church for public worship and religion and moral instruction at Shelter Island near Locust Grove. And the building has been moved. It used to be almost behind the big old hotel. It's been moved, and it's now, we all drive by it, when we're on our way to Greenport and further on. Next. This magnificent portrait is of their daughter, Miss Grace Woodhouse, 1890, and this was the wedding portrait that was done by none other than John Singer Sargent. It's now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and was a gift in 1962 from her daughter, Olga Roosevelt Graves. And so this is the young lady at her wedding. This is she and her daughter, Olga. You can sort of see Olga there, and they're playing outside and in the lawn there. Lorenzo G. and Emma Woodhouse decided to summer in East Hampton the year of their daughter's wedding, because they were no longer going to stay in that cottage, obviously. They had built it for their daughter anyway. They hired Isaac Green Jr. to design a stylish shingle-clad cottage on the south side of Hunting Lane in the village. The work started in 1893, and they moved in Greycroft, as they called it, G-R-E-Y, in 1894. Now, the Roosevelts spent that summer on Locust Grove, but tragedy struck. The young couple's daughter, Olga, born in 1891, and her father lost their beautiful Grace to complications of tonsillitis on July of 1894. And we have a picture of Olga when she was in her late teens. After this family tragedy, the Roosevelts could not stay on Shelter Island any longer. And any land that the Woodhouses owned mostly was sold. And they spent their summer with Grace's parents here in brand new Greycroft, their newly completed East Hampton cottage. It was at this time that the plans were drawn up for Emma Woodhouse's famous Japanese water garden. Little Olga summered with her grandparents at Greycroft for more than a decade, and she loved her grandparents. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of Greycroft, designed by I.H. Green, Jr., as I said. Took 2 years. Started late in 1893 and completed in 94. And if you go to the newspapers, you'll find a few little clippings, such as May 23rd, 1895. L.G. Woodhouse and Mrs. Woodhouse have been in town arranging their newly completed cottage on Hunting Lane. May 20th, 1896, Mr. L.G. Woodhouse of New York has sailed for Europe and has rented his handsome cottage at East Hampton. Also in the 1890s, Mrs. Lorenzo Woodhouse gave some money to what we call the neighborhood house for a small emergency hospital. So already there was sort of the beginning of the largesse that they did to the community. The next slide, it's quite an unusual one. We don't have a lot of photographs of Greycroft, but this is some young people, enjoying the side porch of Greycroft about 1895 on Hunting Lane. Shows you what the styles were in 1895. Next. Now this is one of the scenes. Some of these you've seen. I'm just showing you one tonight. This is Camp Wyckoff in Montauk. Lorenzo and Emma Woodhouse were active in community affairs. The couple helped raise money for the Spanish-American War soldiers who were shipped to Montauk's Camp Wyckoff after the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898. The Star, which brilliantly reports every week, and sometimes it's good to have a weekly because it gives them a chance to think about what they're saying. The Star, September 2nd, 1898, Mrs. Lorenzo G. Woodhouse has leased the second house, which is one of the Kim Meaden, but not Kim Mead, but in that area, one of the early houses, for the reception of supplies from E.H., East Hampton. Apportionment of it and medical supplies and food will be stored there, and there may be room to have care for the sick, because they were always looking for more space because many of the structures were canvas. October 2nd, 1898, most of the patronesses in charge here, and this is written from Montauk, have returned to their city homes. It's October, right? But Mrs. L.G. Woodhouse remains at her villa on Hunting Lane and still pays daily visits to the sick soldiers. Brooklyn Daily Eagle, 1898. Mrs. L.G. Woodhouse and friends are actively working on arrangements for a new hospital. She and Mrs. Manson, right here on Main Street, spent the day in consultation with General Wheeler, who was in charge of the camp. And her role in bandages and raising money and writing letters to the governor and writing letters to the president she was extremely involved in the process. Next slide, please. Now, not all the things the Woodhouses did were things that we could necessarily say were gifts to the community. Sometimes it's because they're very beautiful. This one, of course, doesn't exist any longer. But in 1896, it was noted that East Hampton had over 800 summer visitors. It was decided that a new hotel was needed. In 1898, the Maidstone Improvement Company, headed by William Wheelock, Lorenzo G. Woodhouse, Samuel Skidmore, and Schuyler Quackenbush, all those names we know, formed an agency to build the Maidstone Inn. So he was one of the investors behind the building of the Maidstone Inn. Now, just about the same time, and this is just such a sweet little thing from the Star, there was sailing races almost every week on 3 Mile Harbor. One of the participants was Captain Hussey, and he was racing on his boat, the Emma and Lorenzo, named after his very good friends, Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo G. Woodhouse. Right? The first Maidstone Club on Maidstone Lane was burned to the ground on August 9th, 1901. And Lorenzo G. Woodhouse, along with William Wheelock and Preston Spring, were appointed to a special finance committee to raise $37,000 to rebuild the clubhouse. And this is a photograph, a postcard, just a few years after that new clubhouse was built. Brooklyn Eagle tells us something in September 5th, 1903. And that is that Lorenzo Woodhouse of Manhattan, a cottager here, because it's sent from their reporter in East Hampton, died suddenly yesterday at Graycroft. This is 1903. Lorenzo G. in his summer home. The deceased was born in Rutland, Vermont, and was the son of the late Reverend Dr. Charles Woodhouse. He had been engaged in the dry goods business and was once an associate of Marshall Field of Chicago. His home in Manhattan was at 34 West 53rd Street. He is survived by a widow and one granddaughter, the latter the daughter of Robert B. Roosevelt, Jr. of Sayville. Next slide. This is a view of another one of the Woodhouse's houses. This is Lorenzo G. Woodhouse is mentioned in the Brooklyn Eagle when it comes to some money from his estate. And he left an estate in personal property, 1903, remember, with a net valuation of $2,840,477, according to an appraisement made by William Helpin, one of the state appraisers. The gross estate amounted to $2,924,313. Mr. Woodhouse left a cash legacy of $1 million to his widow, Emma D. Woodhouse, and there were specific legacies left to relatives and friends to the amount of $1 million or more. He will set up a trust fund for his granddaughter, Olga Roosevelt, of $250,000. Also $250,000 to his brother, Charles W. Woodhouse, and also to his son, to Charles Woodhouse's son, Lorenzo E. Woodhouse, he also leaves $250,000. And this is the house that Lorenzo E. built. So, Emma Woodhouse continued to live at Graycroft and to enjoy overseeing her gardens. In 1906, she married Stephen Cummins. 2 years later, she died, leaving the life use of Graycroft to her husband, but the estate would belong to Lorenzo's brother, Charles W. Woodhouse. Cummins and his second wife, Virginia, who loved the gardens and added to them and preserved them, lived at Graycroft until 1920. The tradition of the Woodhouse family members finding their way to East Hampton continued with Charles Woodhouse's son, Lorenzo E., who we're looking at his house, and his wife, Mary. When they arrived at Graycroft for a visit in 1888, Lorenzo was employed by his father's bank in Burlington, of which he became president. The couple had come out to spend some time with his uncle and aunt. They must have fallen in love with the village because they bought the land directly across Hunting Lane from Graycroft in 1903. After several years, they named their summer house the Fens. And the Fens was demolished in 1949. In 1906, the Woodhouse Cup was created for the men's golf at the Maidstone Club. And it was when Lorenzo E. Woodhouse decided to cancel a mortgage that was held by Lorenzo G. Woodhouse against the club, investing to help them with things, and suggested that the interest be used for a trophy in memory of his late uncle. The tournament was always played on Labor Day. Next slide shows you something that was adored by Lorenzo E., and that was automobiles. This is one of East Hampton's earliest autos, and it was owned by Lorenzo E. Woodhouse and his son, Charles Douglas Woodhouse. It was a Stanley steamer, and this is, I think, the neat little note that we have on this. And these photographs, by the way, just recently we had printed from a collection of negatives. So some of these things have not been seen before, because such as the one you saw of Greycroft, that was one, and one of the Fens is a new photograph for us also. But here's the note that's attached. It says, I.Y. Halsey fitted East Hampton's first speedometer to this car. And this was about the time they were talking about how speedy these cars were. Now let's look at another one of Lorenzo's cars. This is a Franklin. And I really had no idea how to date it, because it's not totally clear. And so I corresponded with a couple automobile museums to find out what it really was. And they said, yes, nothing else has a front like that. It has to be a Franklin. And it was the state auto licensing agency that has an archivist who, when I sent a picture, wrote me back and wrote electronically and told me that this was the plate in New York State for 1910. So that's an interesting way to date the photograph. So who would have thought every once in a while the bureaucracy works? Next. Now this is another view of the Fens, probably a few years after the one I just showed. This is a very famous view that's often shown as a postcard. And you may not notice, because I don't think you would have memorized what that house looked like, but that extra group of dormer windows on the top roof, those have been added, between the two photographs. So the Fens got a set of attic dormer windows soon after it was built. Lorenzo E. had a 6-car garage. He built a boathouse at Louse Point and was a member of the New York Yacht Club. He loved sailing his motor launch. Guess what the name of his motor launch was? Shagwam. They had 2 children, Charles Douglas Woodhouse and Marjorie E. Woodhouse. And they both play a role in the story as we progress. Murray Woodhouse also enjoyed the arts, focusing on music, gardening, and painting. Together, they traveled en famille to Europe, often in the spring, returning with collections of photographs that documented their tours. We must have maybe 400 negatives of the tours of Europe that they went on. The gardens at the Fens were spectacular, and the couple often opened them to the public, by the way. So sometimes we see these things as all being private, but they were always having parties and fundraisers, for a number of organizations. Next slide, please. This is a little hard to see. This is a somewhat faded blueprint of Amar Embry II. This is a house that was designed for Lorenzo E. Woodhouse to be built on Egypt Lane in 1911. It no longer stands, but luckily recently the 2 blueprints were given to the Historical Society that begins to document that. And he had a number of cottages on his property, the garden itself, but he also had several on Egypt Lane. Some of them were used for workers, others were used for visitors. Sometimes, visitors who, from reading, might have spent 6 months there, but that's another matter. Next slide. One of these houses does survive. This charming bungalow, which is merely a word for a house that's 1 or 1.5 story high, was designed by John Custis Lawrence. It really is a brilliant house, and it still survives, and it was built about 1916, it's thought. It's part of the estate of the Fens. It's still extant, but the owners have one of the most brilliant, highest, most impenetrable hedges known to man. So most people have no idea that there's a house there at all, but be that as it may. Next, please. So now let's begin to sort of see, what both families, did together, because Lorenzo G, got involved in some situations, as well. And so this is the beginning of what was happening. This is a remarkable postcard. Thank you very much for eBay, because we have always known that the Clinton Academy was used for a number of things. It was an artist studio for a while after, it was no longer necessary because secondary education became mandatory in the state in the 1880s. It was also used as the office for a star for the while, but it was for a while the library. And this is the only image I know of that has the library sign out in front of it. And it shows you what it looked like, because this is what it looked like after it became the town hall and sort of a community center. They took this wall out completely. They took off this floor, they took off this brick wall, and they put a new building back there, and they enclosed the porch to make it more space, and they had a good sized auditorium back there. And once the Maidstone Club and some other things were around, it really there were places to meet, and so therefore it went through a slow period of use, and for a while it was really the birth for our public library. And we organized the Free Library in 1897, and one of its most generous supporters, surprise, surprise, was Mrs. Lorenzo G. Woodhouse, who, besides money for bookshelves and things, she and 4 or 5 of her friends each gave about 450 books, some new, some from their collections. And the Riverhead, the Brooklyn Eagle has this little note that Riverhead, Long Island, August 20th, articles of the incorporation to the East Hampton Free Library were filed in the county clerk's office yesterday. The object of the corporation is to promote good literature and lending of books. Its annual meeting will be held the first Monday in September. There are 12 directors, and one of them was Emma Woodhouse. And there was also Emily Wheelock, Mary Tillinghast, Eloise Osborne, Emma Muchmore, Ellen Hedges. I won't read any more, but it's just like going down. If there was a phone book in 1897, they would all obviously be there. Now, next, I think, are 2 remarkable photographs, which I didn't know about until a couple weeks ago. These are photographs of the library in this building. So this is upstairs, where there's these wonderful braces, which are still there. They're very bracing if you hit your head on them. And if you'll notice, there's our good friend, Reverend Buell, watching to make sure you're quiet in the library, because you look at that face and you're not going to laugh. There's no question about that. And then the next one shows you that, the neat office that you can create up there. There obviously were some other extra partitions and things there, but there are some of the books. So these, I thought, were pretty remarkable survivors. So this seemed like it was a fabulous idea, and it was very, very popular. There had been libraries here before, but they were private. There was a private library here at Clinton Academy, of which still over 150 books survive with the Clinton Academy little labels on them. So people started thinking about, things about the library. And because the Woodhouses were involved in this one, you can see that they might have thought a little bigger. So in 1911, the original grounds and building, just 2 doors down, of the newly designed and built library were given by Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse to the new library, which opened in 1912. In 1913, Mrs. Woodhouse gave a cloister that she built on the back with a reading room that held some quite important paintings that she had in her collection that she had given. And remember, this is before Guildhall, so that would have been a logical thing if you wanted to give some paintings away. She also did some what she called green gardens that had fountains and greenery, but not flowers. Now, if you'll do the next slide, you'll see 2 of the designs there were 3 designs submitted to Mrs. Woodhouse by Amar Embry II. And the very English sort of Elizabethan one is the one that was chosen, but this is one of the designs that was rejected. looks sort of like a Friendlies. And then this one was sort of modernist after all. You know, it's called Georgian in one of the descriptions. These were published in the Architecture magazine in April of 1911. And you can see why that charming English one would have fit into the whole concept of Maidstone and things of that nature. Next, we'll have 2 photographs of the interior taken very soon after the opening. Well, really not. These are really probably from around 1928 or so, maybe 1930. But this is one of the reading rooms. And then this one is quite wonderful because, you know, in doing research, we were able to find some interesting articles that talked about Mrs. Woodhouse giving artwork to the library and what artwork she gave. And over the mantle is a Thomas Moran painting. And if you'll please go to the next slide. It's titled Two Owls. And can you see the little gray owl sitting there? And this was done on one of his trips to Rome. So you're looking over the Tiber at the castle over on the other side. And this is, as you could see from the mantle, it's a good-sized painting. She also gave another painting, which is equally extraordinary, by her dear, dear friend, Childe Hassam. And this is one of Hassam's most famous paintings of Home Sweet Home. And I mean most famous painting of Home Sweet Home, because this is just a very, very famous painting of his. So these were given to the library, which, since the library is not an art museum, and you know, they many, many years ago disposed of them, but it's sort of, but these were in that reading room, and that was, you know, and so this is interesting to see her interest in art, and she was a patron, you know, particularly for, well, quite a number of artists, but Hassam was one that she was, you know, particularly fond of. And then she also gave an antique painting. Next slide, please. This is a painting done by a mid-19th century Sag Harbor artist of Captain Jeremiah Hedges. And this was given by Mrs. Woodhouse to the library also. So, I mean, it's I think, a very interesting thing. So, next, we see the back of the library. This is a photograph that one doesn't see very often. This is what it would have looked like, I think, like 1910, 1911 or so. And that little trickle over there on the right is not a geyser, it's a fountain. So. And next is another photograph of one of the green gardens that, you know, would have been created. And in 1927, the newspaper noted that the library garden, always a surprise, if it's just discovered, or those who've revisited it and read there in its shade often, has been made even more charming by the planting of a green border around the pool and under the porch, the gift of Mrs. Lorenzo Woodhouse, who planned the garden in 1912 and who is continually thinking of additions to its attractiveness. So that's very charming. Mrs. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse and several friends talked about what a good idea it might be to start a garden club. So in 1914, they had a meeting at Frederick Hollister's house, Mrs. Frederick Hollister, and a group of garden lovers got together and, you know, talked about this would be a great idea. They formed their group, and rare for that period was that within 1 year they were admitted into the Garden Club of America. And Mrs. Woodhouse was the first president. Now, let's go back to Vermont for a short little melodrama, and then we'll get on. Because this is from a Vermont newspaper, 1922. And it is a story about Woodhouse versus Woodhouse. Dorrit Stevens, the daughter of a poor soap salesman, grew up in Burlington in the shadow of a South Willard Street mansion. The mansion was located on the corner of Cliff and South Willard Streets and was the summer home of Lorenzo Woodhouse, a wealthy New York City banker and financier. Lorenzo and his wife, Mary Kennedy Woodhouse, had a young son, Douglas, who in 1917 caught the eye of the beautiful Dorrit at a University of Vermont dance. Dorrit and Douglas shared a long and loving courtship, meeting up several times daily at the Stevens home. When Douglas left to join the army, he sent love letters, candy, flowers, music to Dorrit regularly. Dorrit met up with Douglas at his army base, and the reunion of the two lovers proved so powerful that they decided to get married on the spot. The fire of their love would soon be doused by a very upset and angry Mary Kennedy Woodhouse, who objected to her son's marrying outside his own upper class. I mean, there's a slant to this story. She and her husband were sure Dorrit Stevens was a gold digger looking out to cash in on the family fortune. Lorenzo and Mary never spoke a word to their new daughter-in-law, nor was Dorrit allowed entry into any of the Woodhouse domiciles. Lorenzo stepped up pressure on his son's marriage by forcing him out of his job at the Merchants Bank, which was owned by Lorenzo, and cut off his access to a lucrative trust fund from a previous inheritance. That would be his uncle's inheritance, his $250,000 inheritance, right? Douglas and Dorrit were left virtually penniless, and now nowhere to turn but his parents. Douglas appealed to them to restore his position in the family. They agreed, but with one caveat. Dorrit would stay out of sight and out of mind. Douglas acquiesced and joined his parents in visits to New York, where they wined and dined at the Crystal Room at the Ritz. Douglas was invited to winter in their Florida home, but without Dorrit. She was not permitted to join him. He accepted his parents' offer. In Florida, Lorenzo and Mary hatched a plan to break up their son's marriage. I think they've done a rather good job already. They introduced Douglas to Lillian McClellan, a divorced Washington, D.C. social girl. The Woodhouses showered her with affection and money and pushed Douglas to ask for her hand in marriage. But once Lillian found out Douglas was already married, she wanted no part of a relationship, and off she went. But back in Burlington, Dorrit found out that Douglas had gone to Reno, Nevada to seek a divorce. She felt his mind had been poisoned, in quotes, by his parents and the lure of the family wealth and lifestyle. Furious with Lorenzo and Mary, Dorrit turned to the court system and set in motion one of the most spectacular cases in Vermont judicial history. The court case where she sued his parents, the court case between the soap salesman's daughter and the wealthy financier, became a national spectacle. Standing room was at a premium. And the Woodhouse's New York City attorneys squared off against a young Burlington lawyer named Warren Austin. It was called David versus Goliath by locals. Judge Sherman R. Moulton, by the way, presided. The jury was read all 188 of Douglas's love letters and listened to Dorrit speak about the terrible betrayal and with honesty in her eyes, in quotes. Douglas never attended, choosing to remain in Reno. After 40 hours of deliberation, the jury of 12 male Vermonters, 7 of them farmers, awarded Dorrit $464,000. Which, if you use those fancy tabulations on your computer, would come out in today's money, $6.3 million. Which at the time was the largest award of its kind in U.S. history. And that I checked, because this is so flagrant, I wasn't sure if it was true. The ultimate winner was the U.S. court system and the integrity of our country's judges and jurors. The highly paid New York lawyers proved to be no match for the young Vermont lawyer, nor the Vermont jury that rendered the verdict. The privileged class would find no special privilege within the hallowed walls of a Vermont courtroom. The court later reduced the payment, but young Woodhouse did go through with the divorce, and he later married Muriel Jeffrey in Paris, and ended up teaching geological science at the University of California and retired to Santa Barbara. So let's keep on with 1916. There's an article in the Brooklyn Eagle that says that Lorenzo E. Woodhouse is completing a bungalow on Egypt and is completing a bungalow, another one near his residence on Hunting Lane, and contemplates building a fireproof building on his premises to be used for the entertainment of his guests at dances, musicales, and plays. The next slide, please. I do believe the fireproof building is likely the Playhouse, designed by F. Burrell Hoffman, opened in 1917. Hoffman is best remembered by architectural historians for being the designer of James Deering's fabulous Miami house, Vizcaya. So he did some pretty amazing things besides this, obviously. Tradition has it that the building was built as a gift for their daughter's 16th birthday. That's nothing that we found any reference to until somebody wrote it in the 1950s, so we're not really sure if that's true. He certainly didn't refer to it as a gift in the newspaper, but he may not have if it was a surprise. But it was a gift but it was something that was always loved by their daughter, Marjorie Woodhouse. Next is a great photograph of the interior during probably maybe 5-6 years after the building was built. Another slide, the tapestries, the antique pewter. Interestingly enough, we have a pewter plate in the Historical Society collection that was given to us that supposedly came out of the building. So, and it's a German pewter piece. Then I think there's one more slide. So it was quite wonderful with French and Regency and Art Nouveau furniture and, you know, candelabras and concerts. Some of them were fundraisers. The Herters were very good friends of the Woodhouses. And the Herters often did costume parties, and oftentimes when they wanted an outdoor event, they would go and do it at what we now call the creeks. And there was a lot of back and forth between them. And a number of the other artists out here. Once again, Childe Hassam is another one who was a good buddy. Now, let's go back to Clinton Academy. So the next slide, please. And in 1920, Lorenzo Woodhouse and Mary, his wife, not Mary, but Lorenzo Woodhouse, were very interested in doing something about the sad-looking building which housed the library for a while. And so they worked something out with the still existing group who have been meeting since 1784, who are the owners in reality of the educational facility, and rented it got a lease for 99 years. Which was just right, which meant that they would then spend some money and, you know, restore, and Mary was right, of course, when I said Mary Woodhouse, would restore the building. And what we have in our files are the letters, the answers to Mr. Woodhouse's letter inviting people to be, you know, sort of charter members of the East Hampton Historical Society. So this one is by Dr. David Edwards, May 21st, 1921. He would be very pleased, as you can probably see. The next one is from Mr. Buke, who, if anyone in the community would be thrilled by preservation and antique things, it would be he. So he's best thanks for suggesting me as one of the incorporators of the East Hampton Historical Society. I've been looking and hoping for just such a society, and she'll be only too happy to become identified with it. And the last one is the one that I love, because I usually don't like rejections, but this one is so charming. East Hampton, May 31st, and it's written on an old piece of lined paper. Mr. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse, dear sir, in reply to yours, I think I am getting too old to take up any more duties. Am now over 81. Thanking you for the opportunity to assist in incorporating, in improving the village, I remain yours truly, David Gardner. So, even something from Gardner's Island. And the next photograph is a photograph that shows you the beautiful restoration job done in 1921 to bring the building back to what it looked like when it was one of the more famous secondary schools in the state of New York. Next slide. This is Mary Woodhouse's passport photograph. She was known for wearing hats. Now the next photograph, which is probably somewhere in France, we're not exactly sure where, but this was a 1922 trip that lasted 3 months visiting Europe. And this is Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse, and that's a pretty fancy hat also. So you sort of keep looking for Mary's hats. Next slide, please. Now, one of the most extraordinary things we had, and could enjoy, because they were open to the public at times, were the 3 distinct gardens that were created within the Woodhouse estates along Hunting Lane, Greycroft and the Fens. In the late 1890s, Emma Woodhouse installed a Japanese water garden, which is now believed by garden historians to be the first such Japanese water garden on a private property. There were some that were involved with institutions and things, but this seems to be the first one that's been recorded, and that was at Greycroft. Soon after the Fens was constructed, Mary E. Woodhouse created an Italianate garden behind her house. A few years later, she altered it and made it a cloister-style design with walls and a pergola. She also constructed a greenhouse and added several cutting gardens. By 1915, the plantings around her home with the creation of an enclosed garden compartments, which were quite lovely with different color tones for flowers. 1917, she commissioned an arts and crafts style sunken garden for the playhouse, which really linked the gardens. It really linked the playhouse, the Fens, and Greycroft. And what you're going to be looking now, without me blathering too much, are just several images that are now in the Library of Congress, which are hand-colored photographs taken probably somewhere around 1916, maybe 1917. Of the combined gardens. This really would be, by now, we're looking at Mary Woodhouse's garden. If some of the colors look peculiar to you, realize that these are hand-colored by someone who was not at the garden. So you may see something that's a color you don't expect, and that's probably because it's a plant that's real, but it wouldn't really be that color. So here is one of the vistas, and that vista at the end of that photograph, the next slide shows you this this wonderful bench that's at the end of the walk. And that's completely surrounded, as you can see, by pink roses, and they probably really were pink. Water elements, and certainly they didn't call them that, but water elements with fountains and things were very popular. So the next slide shows you one of these elements. This is a very sort of Florentine garden that probably comes out of some of the designs that were done by Parrish for his illustrations for a book on Italian gardens. Very beautiful. Another view. Fountains all over the place. Next. Next. Isn't that totally beautiful? And this would be the Chinese water garden. And the LVIS up on the second floor has an extraordinary chart that doesn't photograph very well. But I'm sure that if you asked, they would let you go up and see it. But it's really the only known complete layout of what the gardens looked like, and tells you what was there, what was planted. It's quite extraordinary. Next. And it's interesting to see a combination of sort of country paths and then wooden walks and then tile and brick and, all of these, just, one of, many people consider that this is one of the top 20 early 20th century gardens, not with us any longer, I'm afraid, but next. And we have a painting in the back before you leave, which is of the Woodhouse Water Gardens, done in 1918 by Arthur Hill, and that shows you this building in the distance. So, next. And that little bridge happens to be in the picture, though I tend to think it's probably not in scale, but that's another matter. Next. And artists from all over came to paint this garden. This one lived on Egypt Lane, Childe Hassam, and this is the water garden done in 1909. And this painting is 36 inches wide, so it's just about that wide, so it's a good size painting. And if you had a lot of money and could pay the insurance and shipping, you could really do an exhibit of probably 25 paintings just of the gardens. I mean, they're just that. And many paintings are now that these color photographs are now available online, the ones from the Library of Congress, there's more paintings being attributed to the Woodhouse Gardens because they've always been just called garden, not identified. This one is, I think, the next one I think is particularly charming. He loved to do these sort of faceless women that were sort of, romanticized. But here, in this garden called Lilies from 1910, Childe Hassam, this one is 33 inches wide and 27 inches high. So it's a spectacular. So, it's wonderful when art creates art, and that's certainly what happens with a gardener creating. And by the way, even though Mary Woodhouse had a professional gardener, he was clear, and her friends were pretty clear, that she designed those gardens, and it was his job to figure out how to plant it and things of this nature. And it was interesting that the first water garden, the one that was done by her, by the first Mrs. Woodhouse, that one was done completely by the owner, by the person, by Mrs. Woodhouse herself. And that was an interesting story because she had brought in a professional who told her that there was no way she could have the type of garden she wanted. They would not grow here because they're too close to the ocean and the soil is too poor. So someone said, I know someone in Sag Harbor who, might know a little more, might be able to help you. He's a specialist in soil. And he came and looked and he said, Madam, he said, this property was a farm for 200 years. He said, if it doesn't grow here, it probably won't grow anywhere. And so that's why she decided she'd do everything herself and hired him to help. And it was one of the most extraordinary gardens. So, sometimes it's good to get another opinion. Next. Now, this, I think, is just extraordinary. We'll only show you two photographs. This is the inside of Lorenzo, Easton Woodhouse, and Mary's home in Palm Beach. It's their villa, Quinta Marina, and built in 1925. It's on Middle Road in Palm Beach. The road originally was called Singer Road, but Mr. Singer, who was a developer of the area, went to prison and was a naughty man. So she petitioned the area to please, change the name, and it's called Middle Road now instead of Singer Road. And before they built this house, they stayed at the famous Everglades Club. So, yeah. And when they left East Hampton, they went to New York and stayed at an equally fancy hotel designed by McKim, Mead & White, the Savoy, before they traveled down to spend winter in Florida. So this is an open area, and then this is the inside here. This is one of the living rooms. And it's interesting to look at it because once again, the eclecticism, Chippendale chairs, French chairs, a little colonial table, and there's just all these different elements. And if you look closely at the walls in this particular room were all painted to look like a sky with clouds. And I don't know if you can see some of those, but people who visited the house talked about this room that you would have expected to be heavy with all this furniture in it, but in reality it was very light and airy. Now, let's go to something more public. This is obviously private. Here's a great photograph of Amar Embry II, just about the time. He was invited, and why not? He did the library after all, by Mrs. Woodhouse to design what she really thought should be here, and that was a museum of art. Because when this place first opened, there was an area to display paintings, but it was obvious with all of the artists coming here, and she was very fond of Thomas Moran and felt that he really deserved to have a gallery room named after him, and Hassan and the rest of her friends. So she bought, next slide, she bought the old Samuel Miller house and the McCann Meat Market right across the street. And the McCann Meat Market was where the 1717 church stood. And typical of the Woodhouse family, and this is something I think to really keep in mind, how many things do we have that are named after the Woodhouses? That was on purpose. They were very happy to be anonymous. When they bought this property, it was announced that it was purchased, but never who bought it. They worked very hard. There was even letters written to the Star saying we should really name this new art museum after the Woodhouse family. Whoops, she would have nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it at all. Did not want her name. And it was a gift to the community. It wasn't to promote her in any sense of the way it was. So the Star said in September 26th, that a long-cherished hope of art lovers here may soon be realized in the erection of a little theater and an art museum on the former J.G. Thorpe property. This property was sold last year and the buyer wishes to remain anonymous. And we know now who the anonymous person was. It was Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse. It also mentions in the article that Amar Embry II was going to be employed as the architect. November 17th, 1930, it does have their name in when she and her husband gave $100,000 towards the building and maintenance. And this is the purpose of Guildhall, which, if you think about the period, the 1930s, there are very few art museums that have theaters in them. It's a theater or opera house or art museum, not the combination. One of the first people to create that after he visited such a place in Manchester, England, was Sam Parrish in Southampton in 1898. And the theater in reality was not originally there. He added the theater some years later when he realized that art and music should certainly go together. So in many ways, what happened across the street was a very special, it was almost the beginning of what we now call arts councils or art centers. The purpose of Guildhall is to cultivate and encourage a taste for the arts through the presentation of drama and music, to provide galleries for display of objects of artistic or historic interest, to further and to have a place for meetings, for committees and organizations of this village to promote and encourage the finest type of citizenship. And that was something that was just developing, at that time, this idea that, a more educated, children should take art in school, they should take shop, they should, home ec. I mean, we need people who have knowledge in a general way so they have some better understanding. Anyway, it opened August 19th, 1931, and I'll just read you, the first line in what the Star says. East Hampton has never known a celebration like that on Wednesday. Next, I think, is a great image. That shows you the museum. But the next one, I think, is even better. It's the Child Hassan etching in 1931. It was almost like, this is what our new wonderful museum looks like. Those big signs out in front, I mean, heaven forbid the zoning board would go nuts. But you'll see the shutters and, the simple design of the building. And in some ways, if you look at the building, and if you don't think in terms of the little turret, you know, the length of it and the simplicity, you know, enlarge it 7 more times and you have the new Parish Art Museum. I mean, it's really a long, thin building with these galleries, so it's really clever. Now, one thing that we found that I thought were wonderful is photographs of the installation in 1931. So let's go to and this is the Moran Room. I mean, look at what it looks like. And that was the idea. You go in now and you see these elegant sort of federal-looking, you know, plaster friezes. And, you know, this had pine paneling on the wall, sort of colonial look. And furniture that's mostly, you know, Georgian in design. And very simple federal chandeliers. Next, you'll see Ruth Dean's beautiful garden as it looked on opening day. And look at the eagle finials. And look at that extraordinary, magnificent fence that was copied from a fence in a Georgian building in Marblehead, Massachusetts. That's noted somewhere in the newspaper. So, and Ruth Dean was the wife of Amar Embry. So, next we have Mary Herter, a painting of her. This was done by Albert Herter, her good friend. Probably, what, 1938, you know, something in that neighborhood. Sitting inside. Apparently she didn't wear a hat. Now let's just scoot. Luckily there's not much more left, but let's scoot to Palm Beach for a moment and look at this wonderful photograph. This is Saturday, March 18th, 1939. And this is the Society of Four Arts. And there's Albert Herter, the artist, in the center, and that's Mrs. Woodhouse, who is about to pull a string momentarily, because she was one of the founders of the Four Arts, which, if you've been to Palm Beach, is a place for concerts and it's library. It's a wonderful art center, and she had Herter design for her some murals, which only recently have been restored. So we can stand back and have her open up, and then you'll see what they look like now. And these were representing art and music. And then he also, on the opposite side, a few years later, and he was very famous as a muralist. And that murals are, you know, you think that they're so solid, they'll last forever. They are often abused, and there aren't so many around. But with the Florentine painting, that's really quite incredible. She first formed, you know, with some friends, a winter residence, a place for concerts, lectures, films, art exhibits, as well as, you know, gardens. And when you think of what she did here in 39 and what she did there in 39, what she did here in 31, you know, in some ways she's sort of, you know, creating a similar thing, a place where all the arts in aesthetic morphology is used, a term fancy people use for that combination of all. And then here's Mary at about 1940, a photograph that's on the cover of Chip Ray's father's picture book about East Hampton. So it's now a very famous photograph. Next. So this happens to be a picture of the 1894 carriage barn from Graycroft, which was used by the Rollins Studio Theater. And he also used the house, Graycroft, as well. And Leighton Rollins was born in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and attended Brown University, where he started their first literary journal. But he became bored and left before graduating. He thought he would go to his parents, who were living in Boston, but they had in the interim left Boston and were living on a family farm, which he wasn't very interested in. So he needed a little money, so he started to work at a theater where he was a ticket sales. Within a month's time, he had, from ticket salesman, he became assistant production manager. He learned very quickly. Within another 2 months, he decided to go to New York, because after all, that's where the theater that was coming there to Boston was mostly coming from New York. And because of his family's money. I mean, he could pretty much do what he wanted to. And he started seeing all of these young actors who were out of work. You know, there was no jobs for them, particularly in the summertime, because, you know, there still wasn't really air conditioning in most theaters, so most legitimate theaters closed during the summer. So he thought, what would happen if we took these actors in the summer? And I found a place, I mean, Mickey Rooney-ish, yes, barn, piano, and we'll put on theater. We'll put on theater, which is exactly what he did. Took about 16 students up to Surrey, Maine, about as high up as you can get, really, and opened what is now thought to be the second summer theater in America. In 1934, he returned to New York and started the Leighton Rollins Theater School in East Hampton through the generous support of his patron, Mary Woodhouse. The school ran for a decade, using both Graycroft House as well as its carriage barn. In 1944, he moved his school to Lenox, Massachusetts, and later to Santa Barbara, California, where he taught and acted and died in 1981. And he was born in 1900, so he was 81 when he died. And here's some photographs. Here's the drama students at a script conference at the Playhouse about 1940. I love this photograph also of Graycroft, 1940 again. And this was what he called rhythmic bodywork. And then the next one I think is really even so wonderful. I keep thinking that Bela Lugosi is in it somewhere, but I don't find him. Although Bela Lugosi, you know, did perform in Dracula, you know, at Guildhall. This is the Ballad of Cocaine Lille. And just so I can blackmail them, this is Martin Samath, William McLeod, and Ruth Enders. And those, I guess they don't know everybody who's in that picture. So that's 1940 also. Okay, now we're coming to the end. In 1921, Marjorie Woodhouse married Frederick Proctor of the Procter & Gamble Proctors. She and her husband moved into Graycroft, which her father had inherited from his father. After divorce in Paris in 1927, she married into the Philadelphia Leddy family, and later in 1933 died in an automobile accident. Lorenzo E. Woodhouse died in 1935, leaving Graycroft and the Fens to his wife. The site of the Japanese garden had been on loan to the Garden Club of East Hampton for use as a nature trail in 1936. She started selling off sections of the Fens in 1939. By 1948, Mary's son Charles persuaded his mother, and he really did persuade her. He was very worried that she was eating up any estate that he might end up getting. So he persuaded his mother that the house was too large for her, and if torn down, it would lower the tax villages, which she said were very high in the village, and also that he would build a new house for her. The house was raised, and she did design a house. And after she worked with an architect, and she added things to it. And after she had worked on it for about a month's time, she showed it to her son, and he realized that it was 400 square feet larger than the house that had been torn down. So that's when. So anyway, in 1951, the nature trail was donated to the village of East Hampton. Mary Woodhouse moved into the Playhouse in 1953 after some slight modification, because she did love to stay here. She loved to be in East Hampton in the summer. The English Manor House environment suited her by creating just the right ambiance for tea at 3. The dispersal of the Fens continued in 1955. She sold the Playhouse in 1958 and died in 1961 at her home in Palm Beach. The Woodhouse family's legacy to East Hampton is almost incalculable. Much of the character of Main Street hinges on 3 important examples of architecture: Guildhall, East Hampton Free Library, and Clinton Academy. All three of these buildings are active centers of our cultural life. And their preservation of one of our wetlands, the nature trail, a home to ducks and geese, gives us a rare natural preserve in the middle of a busy village. The Woodhouses express their love of the community by their gifts of places that engage our pursuits of knowledge, beauty, history, theater, and the performing arts. And one of the ways that we have commemorated them, because they obviously weren't planning on us commemorating them, was back in 1994, the Historical Society did the Woodhouse Centennial Celebration. And so here we are, yep, that's where we should be, back with those guys. Oh, well, we could keep the pretty ladies. But anyway, the guys, there's the Patrickoffs standing in front of the wonderful house that they have preserved lovingly and have shared with the community a number of times, even Hillary Clinton. And they're standing there on the left, and then that Stanley Wagman, who was the president of the East Hampton Society at the time in 1994. And then we just are ending where I think we should. We're ending with, it's often thought that several of the famous dancers, modern dancers, Ruth Denise and some others may have performed. Once again, it's a little hard to document. So this is one thing that the Historical Society did, is they recreated one of these lovely sort of neo-Greek dances with attractive ladies in sort of Greek garb. And what a perfect place to end, looking at the three graces as we think of the three wonderful buildings that we have because of the Woodhouses, and the three sons, and lots of things in threes, but what an amazing family. And there's a whole lot more to the story, but most of us probably need a drink, right? Thank you.